Hello everybody, this is Philip Jonas at Kalamazoo Valley Community College presenting OpenStax Principles of Economics, and today we're covering sections 24.5 and 24.6, Unemployment and Inflation in Aggregate Supply and Aggregate Demand. In this module, you will learn to show the business cycle using aggregate supply and aggregate demand, explain changes in output, employment, and prices using the model, evaluate the importance of the model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and use the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model to understand the current state of the economy. So in our last few modules, we learned about the model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Let's start out right here by looking at a baseline of an economy that is currently maybe not at full employment, maybe with a little bit of an output gap here, but not, all that huge. Let's start out by discussing how we think about our policy goals using this model. So, as a reminder, we have three major policy goals. The first one is often referred to as price stability, which can be a little bit confusing because we're not necessarily talking about prices staying constant, but rather that we have a low, stable, and predictable rate of inflation. In the United States, our target is 2% per year. Now, while we've covered a few different inflation measures in our course, currently our preferred measure for this purpose is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Chain Type Price Index published by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, a measure that's really close to the idea of the implicit price deflator for the consumption category of GDP. Again, our target here is 2%. So let's start out by looking at this measure in the 21st century. So here in blue, we have the PCE price index year-over-year percentage change. And then the green line, handy reference here, for our 2% target. Now, often when we look at, how close or far away are we from the target, you will hear another measure referred to often as the core inflation, core PCE, or more precisely, personal consumption expenditures, excluding food and energy prices. Now, obviously, food and energy prices are super important to the households in our economy. So why would we have a line that excludes them? Well, food and energy prices move around a lot more than other pieces of our rate of inflation. So if you are trying to hit that 2% target, look at the red line here, PCE minus those two categories. You can see there's a lot less up and down movement, and it can make it easier to tell if you are on target. If you're trying to hit a target, aim small. That doesn't mean we're excluding food or energy from our attempts to keep inflation low, stable, and predictable, but it does make the job a little bit easier if we are trying to make a decision, in the moment based on limited data. So let's go ahead and follow our red and blue lines here during the 21st century. And we can see, for the most part, our rate of inflation is pretty close to that 2% line there at the beginning of the 21st century. And then, right at the start of the Great Recession, inflation goes as high as 4%. A lot of that was oil prices rising. So for example, price of gas going over $4 a gallon. You can see we take the energy and food prices out, the red line much closer to the target. And then conversely, since this was a global recession, it just tanked the price of oil. So we see this blue line dipping much lower than the red line. In fact, For a little while there in 2009, we had a much more rare phenomenon, inflation being a negative number, which is also referred to as deflation. Falling prices sounds awesome, actually not awesome. Typically the sign of an economy that's in trouble. We'll get to that. Great Recession ends, and we have a long recovery with our rate of inflation being somewhere between on target or maybe a little bit below target actually. But maybe a little bit below target didn't have us too worried. Then of course our brief COVID recession, and following that, danger, our rate of inflation goes way above our target, as high as a little bit over 7%, at least using this measure as opposed to, for example, the consumer price index, which might have seen even higher readings. So how do we think about this phenomenon using the model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand? So back to our baseline. Here's an economy, perhaps with a small output gap, perhaps not, things are relatively okay. There are basically two major ways in which you can get above target inflation out of this model. Possibility number one, aggregate demand increases, but not just a little bit, it increases enough that it moves us beyond our economy's potential output, like right here. So at this point, the short-run aggregate supply curve becomes quite steep, which means we're looking at rapidly rising prices. What could be going on here? Well, one possible explanation would be that we have a government policy that missed the target a little bit, overshot. Perhaps we raised government spending or cut taxes to try to close this output gap, and we did too much. So we actually overheated the economy going into inflationary territory. Or perhaps the economy is doing something by itself. Let's say there's some, really psychologically positive news. Consumer sentiment goes through the roof. There's tons of spending, and it actually goes into unsustainable territory. So that's option number one. We can get above target inflation if aggregate demand has too much increase to it. Notice that if this is the underlying cause, along with those rising prices, we will also down on the x-axis see an increase in real GDP. Might not be a lot if we're already at potential, because there's not a lot to be had beyond potential. But if we're starting below potential, you're going to see a pretty substantial increase here. And that really can let us distinguish it from the second underlying reason we could show. Option number two, let's go back to the starting point. Here's our economy. And now there is a supply shock. Something negatively affects our short-run aggregate supply curve. Perhaps, let's say, a spike in oil prices, some other big supply chain disruption. Let's take that short-run aggregate supply curve and move it to the left. And of course, here we both get upward pressure on prices. So here's the source of our inflation. But this time around, it's combined with falling output in our economy, with increasing unemployment, with stagnation, which is why this type of inflation is also sometimes referred to as stagflation, because stagnation and inflation, two bad things, are happening to us at once. So that's our goal number one. We want to keep that inflation under control. We'll get to how we address that in a second, but let's address our two other goals here first, shall we? So goal number two, often referred to as economic growth, actually has sort of a combination of two things going on. So number one, of course, over the long haul, we want our economy's potential GDP to increase, our ability to produce goods and services. So fundamentally what we're talking about here is, for an advanced economy, the rate of technological progress. And what's our target here? We'll take anything we get. The bigger the number, the happier we are. But perhaps, unless conditions are really unusual, a realistic good number to expect would be if we can get 2 to 3% progress per year. That'd be pretty nice. Now, what our economy's potential GDP is, of course, is an estimate. You can't observe that directly, but the Congressional Budget Office puts out a number and we'll use that. But then there's a second component. As we know, when it comes to economic fluctuations, our actual GDP might not reach our potential. We might have an output gap where the resources of our economy are going underutilized. And there, the model of aggregate supply and demand has a lot to say, because our target for that output gap is, of course, 0. We do want to reach our potential. It's a little bit different from our potential GDP target, because the model of aggregate supply and demand, while it's got potential GDP in there, doesn't really have an explanation in it of how we might increase potential GDP over time. That's a little bit more over in the domain of an economic growth model. So let's have a look at the numbers. Here is potential GDP as estimated by the Congressional Budget Office compared to our actual real GDP as measured by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And once again, we can see during times of recession, of course, one of these output gaps opens, and then depending on the length of the recovery, closes back up. Big recession here, Great Recession 2008, 2009, big output gap, long recovery, took a long time to get back to potential GDP. COVID recession, even worse decline, but much quicker recovery, since, we could sort of turn off the underlying reason there once we had made it through the pandemic. So how do we think about this using our aggregate supply and demand model? Well, before we talk about that, we also want to look at our third policy goal, often referred to as full employment. Because really, the way the model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand shows us output gaps, it also implies problems on the employment side. Employment or unemployment doesn't show up as a separate variable here. We sort of have to infer it based on what's happening to output on the x-axis. So once again, here's what we're looking for. When we discuss the unemployment rate in our country, there are, of course, conceptually two components to it. Number one, we have the so-called natural rate of unemployment, the long-term rate of unemployment to which our economy tends to return. And that's caused by structural and frictional unemployment in our economy. And the model of aggregate supply and demand doesn't really have anything directly to say about how we get that number smaller. But that's not to imply that we don't want to get that number smaller. Absolutely, our target for the natural rate of unemployment is to get it as low as possible. So we're aiming for a minimum there. And a good number to follow there, once again, what is the natural rate of unemployment? Well, that's going to be an estimate since it's not the actual rate of unemployment. But we're going to rely on the non-cyclical rate of unemployment. That's defined as unemployment if you're removing the effects of aggregate demand fluctuations based on the Congressional Budget Office estimate there. And then number two, we have so-called cyclical unemployment. So that's unemployment associated with fluctuations in our economy. And this we want to target at 0. So here, one of the core uses of the aggregate supply and demand model, how can we fight cyclical unemployment? And that's defined as the part of the unemployment rate that is not natural. So you take the actual unemployment rate, probably should use the headline number here, U3 as published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and then you subtract out the natural rate of unemployment. So let's look at these numbers. Very sort of predictable picture here, 21st century numbers. In gray, we've got our recessions, and we notice during or often even after recessions, the rate of unemployment goes above the natural rate. So to the extent that a gap opens up here, that's our cyclical unemployment. And then here we've got a much bigger, nastier recession, Great Recession, huge increase in the unemployment rate, hitting 10%. And finally, after we're through a long recovery there, COVID lockdown, spike in the unemployment rate, and it's coming right back down. And right now we're a little bit below natural here. Yeah, as always, that's a little bit up to interpretation. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean maybe our estimate for natural is a little bit off? Does that mean our economy is overheating? Well, we can have many fun debates about that. But the point is that the non-cyclical rate of unemployment in red here gives you a benchmark against which you can compare our actual unemployment rate numbers. And we are looking for those two to be right on top of each other. So how does our model explain this? Well, back to our starting position. This time, let's start out with our model being right at the full employment outcome of our economy, right at potential GDP. So how can you get an output gap and therefore cyclical unemployment in this model? Well, possibility number one, if aggregate demand decreases, sudden loss in consumer confidence, sudden decrease in government spending, an increase in taxes, some negative shock hits our economy. We see that as we shift aggregate demand to the left and enter a recession, we get a fall in real GDP that's now below potential output. So that right there is our output gap. And then implied, but not directly on the axis, when we have an output gap, we're not utilizing all the resources of our economy. So unemployment rate goes up. We've got cyclical unemployment. That's option number one. Notice when it's aggregate demand decreasing that puts us into this recession, we have downward pressure on prices. So depending on how severe this is, this may simply manifest as a falling inflation rate, disinflation, or in the really bad version, 2009, we might get into deflationary territory down there. And that's why I was saying deflation sounds awesome, actually a sign of things going pretty badly. But of course, there's a second way in which you can end up with undesirable outcomes on our policy goals number 2 and 3. And that's once again the story of the supply shock. So let's shift the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left instead. So here's oil price going up. Here's if we have some big natural disaster affecting a big part of our economy, some actual bad news for production, we once again notice output gap opens up. So we're going to have unemployment. But this time, this recession, this increased unemployment rate, is going to be associated with prices rising faster. So that's the stagflation story again. All right, so these are our 3 major policy goals and how we think about them sort of becoming problematic as expressed using the model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And that now gets us to the point of, so what are we going to do about it? Well, the approach we have is the idea of active stabilization policy. Can we use economic policy at the government level to get us closer to our policy goals? And how we can do that is going to depend a little bit on the root cause. So if it's aggregate demand shifting that is giving us undesirable inflation, output gap, unemployment, well, we've got some ideas because we can use policy to affect aggregate demand. One very direct way in which we can do that is through the power of government spending and taxation. If, for example, aggregate demand is lower than our policy goals indicate, We could try to increase aggregate demand either by increasing government spending. Government spending is literally one of the components of aggregate demand. So increase government spending, increase aggregate demand. Or a little bit more indirectly, we can implement some tax cuts, hopefully fashioned in such a way that they will encourage additional, for example, consumption or additional investment spending, which will also raise aggregate demand. Of course, we can do all of that in the opposite direction as well. If we've got too much aggregate demand, we can do some spending cuts, we can do some tax increases, try to slow down planned expenditures on goods and services. There's a second major policy tool we've got at our disposal called monetary policy, but that's for a future module, so we'll talk about how that works. If, on the other hand, the problem is coming from a shift in aggregate supply, well, that's a lot more difficult to handle, as I'll show you in the model in just a second, but perhaps this already intuitively makes sense. If, something has hit our economy that's actually disrupting our ability to produce. Perhaps we lost access to a key resource. Again, perhaps that oil price went up. Having the government change how much it spends on taxes isn't going to very directly address that problem. And if we do want to address that problem, well, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. We need to fix the actual underlying problem in our nation's ability to produce goods and services. Okay, so let me take you through these possible responses here using our model of aggregate supply and demand. But before I do that, let me also dampen your enthusiasm a little bit for how well this is going to work. Because you might have noticed, in the real world, we still have economic fluctuations. Active stabilization policy has certainly improved the performance of our economy. Recessions aren't as common anymore. They aren't perhaps as deep anymore, but they still happen. They can still be pretty bad. So what's going on there? Well, the problem is lag. While we have policy at our disposal, it is laggy. And this is exactly what it might sound like to you from, for example, a video game. Lag refers to the gap that exists between an action being necessary and the action actually being complete. So perhaps you're trying to jump your video game character onto a moving platform. Well, there are lags that will make that harder and harder for you. In the area of economic policy, for example, we have number one, the recognition lag. You have to notice that the economy has hit a recession, is overheating, and when it comes to the official definition of recession, that's always backward looking, retroactive. So we have to use current data there, and we have some uncertainty if it's actually happening. You're playing your game. Number one, you have to recognize where's that platform and where is it going, and that takes a little bit of time. Number two, there is lag associated with making a decision in a game, or imagine the decision here that's going to be made is that the government is going to change its taxation policy. Sometimes we joke when something takes a long time, we're like, oh, it's going to take an act of Congress to get this done. Changing taxation literally requires an act of Congress, right? How long does that take? Next, once you've made the decision, you have to implement it. How fast can you hit those controls? Faster than the government can actually update how it raises taxes. And then finally, even after we've made the decision to jump and we've hit the button, there's the amount of time it takes for the action to have an impact. How fast does our character actually jump? How quickly are taxes or spending decisions in our economy affecting aggregate demand? You put all of this together in a game, I give you 3 seconds of lag to hit a moving platform with a character, you're going to jump into the void. Meanwhile, with active stabilization policy, we're talking about total lag times that start at 6 months and can go into years. That is a hard game to play because the action you take now has to be based on where you think this is 6 months, 2 years from now. Now, there is one very nice area of progress here in macroeconomics, our so-called automatic stabilizers. So those are policies that, when the economy goes through a fluctuation, automatically take action. Raise or lower government spending, raise or lower taxation. And those are just vastly less laggy and are one of the things that have made our economy more stable. This isn't a huge aspect of how we stabilize our economy yet, probably less than 10%, according to some estimates I've read. But sounds very promising for our future there, that if we can tweak and put in a few more automatic stabilizers, we might improve the performance on our economic goals even more. Okay, so we've got the solution, we know the problem with the solution. Let's go through our model here one more time. So here's our economy at potential output, full employment, situation is good. First possibility, we enter a classic demand-side recession. Crisis of confidence, stock market crash, something like that. Aggregate demand falls. We got an output gap, unemployment goes up, inflation goes low or perhaps even negative. We want to implement some active stabilization policy. What's the medicine? Raise aggregate demand. So we're going to pass a stimulus bill, we're going to put some money into building some things, or maybe directly in people's pockets so that they can buy some things, and we'll cut some taxes on them. And the goal is, if we can use that to stimulate aggregate demand, to offset this negative shock, we end up right back at full employment. Just turn that ship around, right? But of course, danger. What if, due to lags, what if this was a mild recession, and by the time our policies connect, the recession is already over? So now our boost to aggregate demand hits. Oh, we overshot our target, went beyond potential GDP, are causing inflation above our 2% target. We didn't stabilize the economy, we destabilized it. Okay, look at the other type of situation we might run into. Here's our economy, nicely puttering along at full employment. Unexpected boost to aggregate demand, increasing inflation beyond our target. So what do? Well, once again, conceptually, the idea is time to hit that brake pedal. We're going to raise some taxes, cut some spending. And if we hit it right, aggregate demand will get it right back to the full employment amount. Job well done. But lags, what if our economy has already self-corrected? By the time the policy hits, aggregate demand overshoots, and now we've put our economy into a recession. Job not well done. So here you see basically a judgment trade-off we have to make. Yes, we have tools that can stabilize our economy, but because they are so blunt and slow, we maybe don't want to use them for every single economic fluctuation. We want to save them for the ones where we think the problem is going to persist for maybe at least a year or two, so that there's less risk of overshooting. And that's for your classic demand-side fluctuations. Now, fortunately, much less common, but it can also happen. We can, of course, have our economy hit with a supply-side shock. So let's go ahead, take short-run aggregate supply, shift it to the left, and here we see the stagflation problem. We're missing all of our policy goals. Inflation too high, output too low, unemployment above target, what do? Well, assuming for a second that we cannot directly fix the supply side problem, assuming for a second that we are limited to demand side policy, we have a total conundrum now. Because if we prioritize, let's fix the output gap and bring unemployment down. If we want to prioritize that, the move is increase aggregate demand. But look what that does on the price side. Inflation is already above target, and now we're even going to go further above target. So we're making one side worse, we're making the other side better. So perhaps, if we're in the stagflation situation, perhaps if we prioritize inflation, we should not stimulate the economy, wait for short-run aggregate supply to return to its full employment amount. But that means for however long this supply shock remains, we are going to have output below potential and lots of cyclical unemployment. Ultimately, two bad choices at once. Okay, so where does all of this leave us? We've got our policies, but maybe we shouldn't use them? Well, this is where the nuance comes in. It's not as simple to say, hey, in economics, we want to stimulate consumption because that's good for the economy. No, it depends. Like if, for example, consumption is below that full employment output, we want to return aggregate demand to full employment, then sure, more consumption is good. If we are already at full employment, or maybe even beyond it, more consumption is bad, right? It's on the one hand. On the other hand. So what we have to look for here is to be able to make a reasonable diagnosis about the state of our economy before making a policy decision. So if you look at our model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, here are sort of three states we could be looking at. If our economy is somewhere around full employment, like E3 right here. So we're going to have inflation right around that 2% mark. We're going to have GDP at potential. We're going to have the unemployment rate at the non-cyclical rate of unemployment. At this point, should we stimulate the economy? No! We're destabilizing. Hands up. Don't touch the controls. Like, this is fine. Don't get me wrong. There are many great debates we can have about types of government spending we should or shouldn't undertake, taxes we should or shouldn't raise, absolutely. But these are going to be the usual discussions about what we want those taxes to accomplish, what we want that spending to accomplish. They will not be justifiable using a let's stimulate or break the economy argument. But then we might have a classic demand side recession, like equilibrium 2 here, where we are below potential output and you do see inflation below target. And at this point, policy becomes an option. But again, nuance. I want you to be careful here. How far are we from potential? How long do we think this is going to last? If this is a relatively mild recession, as sort of not nice as it sounds, there's a real case to be made that we want to be careful with stimulating the economy because there's a real risk of overshooting on the correction. And then finally, we've got something like the Great Recession of 2008. Really bad shock to aggregate demand, GDP way below potential, inflation at zero or perhaps deflation territory. Well, time to open the floodgates. This one, everybody knew at the time, was going to last for many, many years, and it did. So there's basically no risk of overshooting. Go ahead, do the stimulus spending, cut the taxes, do the monetary policy we'll talk about down the line. do what you can to get us back to full employment output. You are very unlikely to overshoot. In fact, even though we took huge stimulus measures in 2009, the recovery took like a decade. But as a consequence of having this toolkit at our disposal and taking these aggressive measures, that recession, bad as it was much less bad than it otherwise would have been. And perhaps on some level, that summarizes our progress from the inception of macroeconomics in the modern sense, right around the beginning of the 20th century, and there the Great Depression, obviously much worse than the 2008 Great Recession, to nowadays, where this bad aggregate demand style recession can still very much affect us, but through policy, we've learned to make it milder. And that is worth a lot. So, in this module, you learned to show the business cycle using aggregate supply and demand, explain changes in output, employment, and prices using aggregate supply and demand, evaluate the importance of the model of aggregate supply and demand, and use the aggregate supply and demand model to understand the current state of the economy. I will see you next time.